Well, the other thing that I want to mention is, what was it? In terms of the political importance of it, and hold on, never mind. There's any other I have when we were talking, and now it's just food for. But cultural studies. You want to say anything about maybe reframe what you said about the contribution of Philippines to study? You made it very specific. You talked about American. Do you have any comments to say about Canada by any chance? Just to make it more.
Well, sometimes you hear popular culture studies debates today being framed in terms not so dissimilar to the general culture debates around the New Left Review in the mid-'60s. That is to say, there was an early cultural New Left from the late 50s and early 60s associated with the magazines University and Left Review and the New Reasoner. And then a later Left Review, New Left Review, in the late 60s, early 70s that was radicalized, much more committed to European theory, and disgusted with Labour Party gradualism, and wanting to break out and go further left. That kind of debate is in some ways, I think, being replayed, especially in the Canadian-American scene, between what's sometimes thought of as left populism and postmodernist cultural studies, with much of the left populist discussion tending to be more insular or more nativist in a British, American, or Canadian sense, and less enamored of French postmodernist theory. And with, of course, the postmodernist side committed to European theory, believing that it is truly liberating and that the manifold possibilities that popular culture studies affords of trying finally to bridge the gap between the cultural avant-garde and a mass audience could be achieved. And this is the great problem, of course, the avant-garde has had during the century, that it has tended, for whatever its rhetoric, to finally be an elite that speaks among itself, their fellow converts. So here, popular culture studies, cultural studies, can serve as a kind of academic intellectual avant-garde that would finally, via criticism, return much of the work of the avant-garde to the people, to a populist audience, and so then serve as a left politics that way. So that I find to be just an interesting reenactment of a moment in intellectual history from the early 60s, in the same way that you saw, especially in the British scene, a division in the early and later New Left between British and European theory or criticism. You see today something somewhat similar in a left populism, and the populism tends to focus on the praxis of everyday life. That's the old concern of the early Raymond Williams and Stuart Hall and New Left Review. And on the other side, a postmodernist criticism derived from Parisian thinking that is rather skeptical of focus on everyday practical concerns and much more interested with conceptual problems of the simulacrum and of image and of technological determinism and so on. So I think the coincidence of these two moments from the early 60s and now the early 90s is very fascinating, and perhaps there's some lessons to be learned.
Wonderful. That was a great wrap-up, actually. We could use that as a kind of a frame for a lot of the stuff that we've been taking, especially the theoretical detail. So,
there was one other thing that we had talked about yesterday I could mention.
Go ahead. Be as spontaneous as you want.
Oh, okay. Well, I was getting this kind of question all the time in the mid-'80s, and of course even now, about George Orwell. What would he say today about, and you fill in the blank, and anything from nuclear stockpiling to contemporary music to state of cultural studies. here's somebody who pioneered popular culture studies as an intellectual domain of activity. What would he say today about the people who have built on his early work? And I personally think that he'd be much more sympathetic to the kind of criticism that has been characterized as left populism, that is engaged with the praxis of everyday life. From his standpoint, some of the work of certain postmodernists might seem to be utterly unintelligible and perhaps not at all populist because it would be relatively completely inaccessible to a mass audience. On the other hand, there was a side of him that was very quixotic and pleasure-seeking, and not at all puritanical or ascetic, despite the reputation that he was later to have in the 50s in London. And sometimes I think the emphasis on sheer play and pleasure that some postmodernist cultural studies critics have would meet with his great approval, because shattering the hegemony of any single monolithic approach to cultural study would have met greatly with his approval. And that it reflects his own empirical cast of mind. Whatever would be helpful to the task at hand would be something that he would be eager to consider. So what would he say about cultural studies today? I think that he'd probably have a greater affinity with the tradition that has more directly emerged from him, British cultural studies via the early Raymond Williams. But I think he'd also be open to some of these newer approaches.